Hello, and welcome to Back Then,
Right now.
where we talk about how things were back then and why they matter right now. Topics like lust and adultery and divorce can be difficult to talk about, especially because they have a history of being treated as things to be whispered about rather than be discussed. There can be a lot of shame that revolves around those conversations. But we here at Back Then, Right Now aren't about that shame game. And it's only by talking about these topics that we hope to heal some of the pain that has been caused over literal centuries.
Absolutely. And as it turns out, there's plenty to discuss. But I'm not going to go too far into historical details about adultery and lust, though I'm positive there's plenty of material out there, which shouldn't be surprising. Surely folks back then loved talking about who was getting with who as much as they do these days. Instead, I want to begin with a reminder of something that Pat established in his sermon, and that is that back then, women, particularly wives, functioned as property more than people. Marriage was very much a financial transaction, and punishments for adultery didn't reflect someone being punished for violating trust or covenant or another person's body, but rather violating and misusing another man's property. Back then, women's value was determined in relation to the man she belonged to. And while we like to believe that we've come a long way, we actually see similar thinking really frequently right now. Especially when we talk about respecting women or preventing abuse, phrases like that's someone's daughter or that's someone's sister or mother, so on, tend to get used. And while we don't say it outright, the implication is often that's a man's daughter or sister or mother. Doesn't it get more to the heart of the matter to say that's someone, full stop? This is a similar move to what Jesus does when talking about lust. The action he prescribes is about accountability to self and others. You gouge out your eye. You cut off your hand. It's not about disrespecting someone else's property. It's about respecting and humanizing another human.
And that's a similar vein that runs through Jesus' words about divorce too, especially because Jesus' position differed from the norms of how divorce unfolded, namely that men could typically divorce their wives for a wide range of reasons, almost trivially. In fact, there were only two circumstances where a man couldn't divorce his wife: if he wrongly claimed that his wife wasn't a virgin when she was given to him, or if he slept with a virgin who wasn't engaged to anyone else, since that would make him an adulterer too, since she belonged to another man. In that case, he had to marry the woman he slept with and forfeited his right to ever divorce her.
So here's the thing. We've discussed how back then Jewish laws were upheld by courts which varied in size and authority, the biggest being the Great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. But what we didn't talk about is how the Sanhedrin was guided at this time by a pair of great teachers called zugot, which is just the Hebrew word for pear, as in two, not pear as in the fruit that kind of tastes like an apple but better. Now, in the time when Jesus was around, the zugot were Hillel and Shammai, with Hillel being the higher authority, especially because he was from the line of David. Now, we're not going to get all the way into the weeds about Hillel and Shammai here. What you really need to know, though, is that at the same time Jesus is teaching, these teachers are planting some seeds that are going to grow to be significant cornerstones of Jewish tradition and theology. So what we're about to talk about comes from what's called the Talmud, which is pretty much the central text for Jewish law, theology, and life. It doesn't come around until well after Jesus, but like I said, the seeds are being planted around the same time Jesus is teaching, and taking a look at what those seeds grow into can actually teach us a whole lot. Biblical divorce, as it appears in the laws of Moses, appears pretty simplistic. There's a scene in The Office where Michael Scott tries to declare bankruptcy by walking out into the office and just shouting, "I declare bankruptcy." And that's really not too far off the mark for how a divorce might have unfolded. A man had to write a certificate of divorce and hand it to his wife. And this was also accompanied by a public declaration of divorce, which was primarily so that there were witnesses to confirm that a woman was divorced and thus available for remarriage. Some aspects of ancient divorce also share some syncretism with other ancient Near Eastern codes and customs, though. An example of that is how, once the woman was sent away by her husband, it was presumed and expected that she would return to her father's house. By the time we get to the Talmud, though, Jewish divorce wasn't just, here's your certificate, which is called a get, and now we're through. Divorce was seen as a necessary evil, but an evil nonetheless, as ideally, marriage covenant parallels the eternal covenant between God and Israel. Yet, Talmudic sages, that is, those who carry out and consider how the law is to be implemented, had the wisdom to recognize that the ideal and reality don't always align, and thus set traditions in place for when divorce was necessary. Still, they didn't make it an easy process, and this was in part in the hopes that the husband might reconsider the divorce while having to jump through the hoops needed to have it officially recognized and valid according to the Talmud. The writing of the get became more involved with the Talmudic principles, having to be given to the wife immediately after being written, with no action in between. A husband couldn't write it, then go to work, and then give it to her. A scribe couldn't write it for the husband, then give it to the husband to take back home. The ink essentially had to still be wet. Likewise, they added that there must be two witnesses who were present at both the writing as well as when it was handed to the wife. And these principles of divorce are so binding that even to this day, Orthodox Jews don't recognize a civil divorce as valid. Since marriage is seen as a holy covenant and not a civil contract, divorce must be overseen by Jewish leaders, which administer and facilitate the process of the get.
While there are some aspects that are different and perhaps preferable now, there's some consistency between back then and right now. And that's that divorce is a messy, painful process. And that's appropriate because we're talking about covenant. Covenant doesn't ask questions of what am I obligated to, but seeks something deeper. In a way, we can take some comfort in that covenant is difficult to unweave. That can be reassuring when it comes to our covenant with God. You don't just say uncle and bow out. God does not send us away headed for isolation. God upholds covenant. Period. Even if we don't, God does. With that in mind, perhaps it's the call of the church to make good on what God's way of covenant, that we would recognize the pain that comes with divorce and ensure that it doesn't result in isolation of the one who is already hurting, but rather to surround them just as the love of God does, because God's covenant of love does not unravel.
And that's a small glimpse into how things were back then. Right now, we want to hear from you. What helps you see people as people rather than objects? And who keeps you accountable to that? And how do you invest in the covenantal relationships in your life?
Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you next time on Back Then,
Right Now.